podcast from the Pell Center. I'm Jim Ludes, Executive Director. Our guest this month is the Pell Center's newest senior fellow, Iskander Rehman. Iskander joins us after a tremendous career in Washington, D.C., most recently at the Brookings Institution. Iskander, thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Jim. It's great to be here.
Well, so the idea today is just to learn a little bit about you, your background, and what you're working on. You're a senior fellow for international relations here at the Pell Center. You've been on the job now for a month.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. Well, as you can probably tell from my accent, I was born in the UK, in London. And when I was 10, my family moved us to the south of France. So I spent my middle school and high school years in the south of France, which was a pretty nice place to grow up, actually. And then I went to Paris for my university education. So I got my bachelor, 2 masters, and a PhD, all from the same institution, Sciences Po Paris, in Paris.
It's a great school. And you spent a lot of time working in D.C.,
yes,
with some excursions to some other exotic locations.
Yeah. So I've always had a profound interest in Asia, Asian culture, Asian history, Asian societies, and I think I derived that maybe from some members of my family. So my late grandfather was an avid collector of ancient Chinese jades and antiques, and a great lover of Tibet. Which I think is something he probably had in common with Senator Pell.
It's true.
And my mum also had a profound interest in Asia all her life, and in India in particular. She spent a year teaching in southern India in a convent school when she was younger, and she ended up marrying a man who was half Indian. So, yes, in a way, I guess it's partially in my DNA, let's say.
That's terrific. And you've been working, though. I mentioned Brookings. You've also been at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace,
Yeah.
the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment. What attracts you to sort of the think tank world as opposed to a more traditional academic career?
Well, there was a period after I'd completed my master's when I really wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do next. I did a short internship at the French MOD, and I'd thought about pursuing a PhD, but at the same time, the academic job market in France can be very, very difficult, and there's not the same kind of interface that there is here in the US in between the think tank world and policymakers. Although, I mean, there are some think tanks in France that do very good work. There is not the same kind of revolving door system that there is here in the US, where retired government officials or government officials who are waiting out a term spend their time in think tanks and then go back into government. So I was a little bit worried that if I did pursue a purely academic career, that I would end up a little bit working in my ivory tower. And even if I was producing interesting and policy-relevant research, it may not have much impact on the public discussion. But then I was fortunate in that I managed to obtain a pre-doctoral fellowship at the German Marshall Fund for a year. And so I came to Washington for a year, and I absolutely fell in love with the Washington think tank scene, which was something that I'm sure you can empathize with. And I also ended up meeting the woman who would become my future wife.
That helps.
Which helps, yes.
Well, so now you're here and you're working on a couple of really sort of big projects.
Yes.
Let's talk about them a little bit.
Sure.
So let's start with the work that you're doing on the India-China strategic balance.
Yes. So my PhD dissertation explored the role that the Indian Navy and Indian sea power more broadly played in India's evolving grand strategy. And of course, when looking into that, the topic of Sino-Indian maritime interactions, friction, competition became one of the sub-themes. And I decided, having completed my PhD, to explore that topic in a little bit more depth, but moving away somewhat from the Indian Ocean to look at what's happening along the disputed land border between India and China, which is actually the longest disputed land border in the world. So I'll be doing some work on that. Hopefully some articles on that issue will be coming out soon. And then there's another larger project that I'm working on while I'm here, which is a book project. And this book is going to examine how various secondary states in the Asia Pacific that have a history of neutrality or non-alignment, so to speak, are adjusting their defense postures in reaction to China's military rise. So it's looking at countries that are not formal allies of the United States. Countries such as Vietnam, India, Indonesia, Singapore, although Singapore is a very close security partner of the United States, it's not a formal ally, Mongolia, and hopefully getting a better sense of how they are perceiving and reacting to the evolving security environment.
And what do you think so I want to talk to you a little bit about, unpack these a little bit. You talk about the disputed land border between India and China, and most of that is in the Himalayan mountains, right?
Yes.
So, yes. I mean, how big of a variation, how big of a dispute are we talking? And then in terrain as inhospitable as that, what's really at stake? Is it just national pride, or are there resources at stake? What varies with how you move that line on a map?
So yes, there are several factors at play. In terms of sheer resources, I'm not sure that one could argue that there is much at stake. However, in terms of how both post-colonial nations conceive of their borders, their nationhood, their sovereignty, it's an incredibly important issue for both countries, and one that also has something of a fraught past. Both countries went to war in 1962 over this border.
Right.
I think for China, it's very closely tied to the Tibetan issue.
Yeah.
Because a lot of that border, not all of the border, but a lot of the border falls under what one could call Tibet's traditional sphere of interest.
Yeah.
And the Chinese Communist Party's argument has been, in the case of some Indian-controlled states, such as Arunachal Pradesh in northeastern India, their argument has been to say that because Arunachal Pradesh fell under the suzerainty of the Dalai Lama in the past, it therefore, by extension, belongs to China, which is something of a specious argument, of course. But that's the logic advanced by China. Another issue that one comes across that makes things more complex when it comes to this border is that it's not actually defined. So it's referred to as the line of actual control because many parts of the border have not even been formally delimited or agreed upon by both sides.
Wow.
So that imposes a degree of uncertainty in terms of both states' interactions, because both sides will occasionally err on what they perceive. Occasionally Chinese patrols will wander into Indian-controlled territory or Indian-claimed territory, or Indian patrols will wander into Chinese-controlled or Chinese-claimed territory, and both sides will say, well, we haven't exchanged formal maps on this sector of the border. It's an error of interpretation.
Yeah, but the root of I guess the tension in the dispute is really about the two countries' colonial history and their sense of national sovereignty and really national pride, right?
There's an element of that, and I really think that on the Chinese side, the Tibetan issue is an extremely sensitive issue for them. The fact also that the Tibetan government in exile resides in India, that the Dalai Lama has said in the past that that he sensed that there was a chance that his reincarnation could occur outside Chinese-controlled Tibetan territory in Arunachal Pradesh, for example, Indian-controlled territory, introduces a whole new element that's sometimes somewhat esoterically called reincarnation politics, they call it, whereby the Chinese are trying to control every aspect of the Tibetan question.
Yeah. So what's the dynamic for the United States in that relationship? I mean, you're sort of looking at a binary relationship, but if you insert sort of the United States into that, because that's what the United States always does, tries to insert itself into these issues.
Yes.
Where are the interests for the United States? What are the interests that American policymakers have to keep in mind thinking about the relationship between India and China?
Well, of course, since the end of the Clinton administration, really, the United States has been drawing a lot closer to India. Both sides' relationship now is a lot broader and more multifaceted than it was during the Cold War, where there are occasionally moments of profound mistrust and even hostility. That being said, after the 1962 war, there was a moment where there was a real potential for greater Indo-US strategic convergence in Asia, as their number one concern at the time, at least in that part of the world, was communist China. And Nehru, the former Indian Prime Minister, for all his talk of non-alignment, could actually prove pretty flexible in terms of his diplomacy and security policy. And during the 1962 war, India did actually appeal to the United States for assistance, which was provided to them by the Kennedy administration.
Yes, the United States relationship with China right now is all manner of complex. And when you look at sort of the most visible manifestation of the competition, particularly in the South China Sea between the United States and China, is there a role for India to play? There's so many of the nations around the South China Sea are involved, but is there a role for India to play in the international resolution of that dispute?
Yes, I think India can actually play a very important role, not so much as an external balancer, which is what some in India have argued, and some Southeast Asian countries have argued. Although it can definitely play a role, but more as a positive role model and as a promoter of norms, especially when it comes to freedom of navigation. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually in the process of completing a report for Brookings that compares India and China's attitudes towards freedom of navigation and the law of the sea, and how those attitudes have evolved over time. And what's interesting is that whereas both countries shared certain commonalities with regard to how they interpret foreign military activities in their near seas, whether it's in their exclusive economic zones or in their territorial waters, there is something of a shift underway. Whereas India is becoming a much more vigorous promoter of freedom of navigation, and China, on the other hand, as we've seen from its recent reaction to the Hague-based tribunal's ruling of the South China Sea, has become a lot more vigorous in its opposition to certain core norms and aspects of UNCLOS, of the law of the sea. So one rising power is becoming more hostile to these multilateral norms, whereas another rising power, encouragingly, is becoming a lot more vigorous in its defense of those same norms. So it's interesting seeing how there's this growing normative divergence in between both powers, and what my report does is it tries to unpack this a little bit and explain maybe why this is happening now. We'll look forward to reading that.
Do you what do you see the future of China-India relationships looking like? Is it a relationship that's headed for conflict? Is it a relationship that is where do you see it headed?
Well, a friend of mine in a book that he wrote a few years ago aptly characterized the relationship as being one of cold peace, which has elements of competition, but there are also elements of cooperation, particularly when it comes to trade and economic issues. Both countries have a growing trade relationship. They sometimes see eye to eye on issues such as climate change or trade issues at the WTO. I think the relationship has become somewhat more rivalrous over the past few years. But at the same time, China is becoming somewhat more invested in India's neighborhood in South Asia through the promotion of its One Belt, One Road project and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the idea of sort of creating this giant infrastructure and transit route from Western China through Pakistan to the Arabian Sea.
Right.
And although that causes a lot of concerns in India, I think it also prompts China to be somewhat more circumspect and balanced in its dealings with both South Asian countries. So, for example, recently there was a terrorist attack in India, the Uri terrorist attack, and India decided to publicly riposte only a day or two ago. They ordered special forces to cross the line of control in between India and Pakistan to take out some terrorist launch pads on the Pakistani side of the border. And China's reaction has been very cautious, circumspect, and apparently behind the scenes they've really been exerting more efforts to rein Pakistan in. Pakistan, that since the 1960s really has been a proto-ally of China.
Yeah. So it's fascinating. So we're almost out of time here, but just quickly, how do you typically do your work? So you're working on this distant region of the world, big strategic issues from Newport, Rhode Island. How do you do this work?
Well, I think a big part of it is not becoming an armchair strategist. One criticism I would have of DC is that there are way too many armchair strategice
who never leave the Beltway and never.
Yes, or if they do leave the Beltway, they'll spend maybe 3 or 4 days in a nice air-conditioned hotel room somewhere in an Asian capital. And although that has value, it's not necessarily the best way to get a full appreciation of the wide tapestry of voices and viewpoints that you have in different Asian strategic communities. So what I'm really looking forward to doing for this book in particular is spending a substantial amount of time in Indonesia, Vietnam, Singapore, India, of course, and Mongolia, to get a better sense of what the strategic elites over there
actually talking to people
and are actually talking about. Yes. So a lot of that is interview work, following up with those people via email, phone conversations, even after you've left the country. In many cases, those people end up becoming your friends as well, and hopefully they introduce you to new people, interesting people, not only in government but also in civil society, journalists, think tankers, academics, NGOs, etc.
Well, it's remarkable work, and we're thrilled to have you here at the Pell Center.
I'm delighted to be here. Beautiful campus.
Folks can look forward to seeing some of Iskander's work on pellcenter.org. That's it for this month's podcast. Iskander, thank you again.
Thanks for having me.